Lachlan, mate, I wouldn't touch that signature page with a boat hook, the buyer's lawyer said, and the whole 14th floor of that Auckland law firm went so quiet I could hear the harbor wind leaning on the glass. My flat white had gone stone cold an hour ago. Lachlan's fancy fountain pen just hung there in midair like a seagull that forgot how flying works. And every single person at that table turned to look at one paragraph. One paragraph I'd written 6 years earlier, on a rainy Sunday in Wellington, while Lachlan was in Queenstown doing what he called strategy and what his credit card statements called heli skiing. But hang on. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 3 months, to when I was still the ghost in the building. My name's Briar Kennard. Back then I was 38, and I'd spent 11 years as the senior contracts and compliance manager at SouthStack, a logistics software company in Wellington that Lachlan Price liked to tell journalists he'd built with his bare hands. Which was true, if by bare hands you meant my keyboard. I drafted the licensing frameworks, the supplier agreements, the IP assignments, the data clauses, the non-competes, every last bolt and weld in the legal scaffolding that made SouthStack worth $52 million instead of a couple of laptops and a beanbag. And at every investor update, Lachlan would stand up there in his merino quarter zip and say things like, "Our contracts are bulletproof." I personally made sure of that. And I'd sit in the second row with my notebook, quietly fixing the clause he'd just misquoted, while he soaked up the applause like a sponge in a puddle. You ever pack someone's parachute, watch them jump, and then hear them tell the whole sky they folded it themselves? That was my Tuesday. Every Tuesday. I'd be at my desk by 7, before the wind even properly woke up over the harbor. I'd untangle whatever mess the sales team had promised a client at the pub the night before. I'd rewrite indemnity clauses that a junior had copied off some American template, complete with references to Delaware law, in a contract for a freight company in Tauranga. And then I'd get pulled aside by people and culture because apparently I had an attitude problem for skipping Friday drinks. I didn't wear the branded hoodie. I didn't do the icebreakers. I didn't pretend I hadn't noticed that Jasper from business development kept forwarding my internal pricing memos to his old flatmate at a competitor. There was one all hands, I still remember it, where Lachlan made a joke about Briar's black magic legal voodoo saving our bacon again, and the whole room laughed, and I laughed too, even though it felt like swallowing gravel with a smile on. I wasn't there for the applause. Truly. I was there because contracts were the one thing in this world I was properly, frighteningly good at. Taking the chaos of ambitious men and turning it into clean, enforceable lines on a page. One clause at a time. Now, before we go any further, I know about 93% of you are listening to this while you're reheating last night's mince on toast or stuck on the motorway, nodding along, and you haven't subscribed. That's all right. Commitment's scary, I get it, I've read enough employment agreements to know. But if you tap that subscribe button, maybe give this a like while your dinner spins around in the microwave, it genuinely helps us keep digging up stories like this one. And trust me, this one gets better. Much better. Right. Back to being invisible. They called me the machine around the office, because I never missed a deadline and never made a scene. I once redrafted a 60-page carrier agreement overnight while the marketing team spent the same week arguing about the font on a tote bag. I still have that tote bag. It says ship happens. I drink my tea out of spite mugs and carry my lunch in spite bags, that's just who I am. The truth is I never wanted credit. What I wanted was order. Clean margins, version control, a paper trail you could follow in the dark. I wanted to be left alone with my tracked changes and my reputation as the woman who could outcontract anybody in the country. But then the acquisition whispers started. An Australian private equity outfit, Coleridge Ritual, sniffing around. And Lachlan started getting sloppy in that very specific way men get sloppy when they can already smell the boat they're going to buy. He turned up late to board meetings. He started saying things like liquidity event in normal conversation. And the temperature around me changed. Suddenly I was asked to summarize all my contract structures for onboarding purposes. I was quietly dropped off the deal room invite list. Legal updates started routing around me like I was roadworks. And my own documents started turning up in meetings with somebody else's initials in the footer. I told myself it didn't matter. Briar, I said, you're paid to think, not to be seen. But you can only live in the margins of your own work for so long before you notice exactly whose hand is holding the eraser. The eraser had a name, by the way. Tobias Mercer. External counsel, brought in by Lachlan especially for the deal. First time I met him, he was wearing cufflinks shaped like little anchors and smelled like a duty-free shop had exploded. He's the kind of guy who says let's circle back and means I'm about to take your work, laminate it, and sell it back to you. He plunked a stack of my own contracts on my desk, printed and highlighted like a first year's exam notes, and asked me to talk him through the logic behind the structure. His tone suggested he was asking a cleaner to explain a mop. I looked at him for a good long second. You mean the logic behind the IP framework that's holding this entire acquisition together, I said. And he grinned and said, exactly, just bullet points for the data room, nothing fancy. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever read a licensing clause all the way to the end without moving his lips. Instead I nodded, went back to my desk, and summarized all 71 pages, line by line. Not just because it was my job. Because if someone was planning to do me dirty, I wanted the paperwork to scream their name when it finally went off. The next morning, Lachlan came to my desk like he was filming his own documentary, with someone from People and Culture trailing behind him like a security guard at a mall. She wouldn't look at me. He couldn't stop smiling. He dropped a manila folder onto my keyboard like it owed him money. We're restructuring, he said. Your role's being sunset after the deal closes. You'll have 4 weeks to transition your responsibilities. Tobias will own the legal framework going forward. Sunset. He said it like it was a spa package. Transition to what? I asked. Calm as Wellington Harbor on the one day a year it behaves. Knowledge transfer, Tobias chimed in from behind him. Walk throughs on the proprietary clauses, systems access, your markup logic. Nothing personal. Just streamlining. And then Lachlan leaned in, because of course he did, and said, you've done great Mahi, Briar, honestly. But this is the big leaks now. And look, if you ever get any funny ideas about making noise, he tapped the folder, we'll just lawyer you quiet. He actually winked. A wink. Inside the folder, a severance offer that worked out to less than my last bonus, a glowing reference letter clearly written by someone who'd never met me, and a confidentiality deed that, and I promise you this is true, had been adapted from a template I wrote. The word legacy appeared twice in that folder. Both times it was describing software. Not once was it describing a person. He was waiting for tears. Or shouting. Or bargaining. What he got was, of course. Then I stood up, took my little pot plant and my ship happens tote, and walked out like I was just finishing a shift. No slammed doors. No speech. But here's the thing. As I handed in my swipe card at the front desk, I clocked something. The new access system they'd been rolling out hadn't migrated the old archive server yet. My credentials on that thing were as old as the company. And nobody, not Lachlan, not Tobias, not a single one of those streamliners, had thought to ask what the machine still remembered. I drove home over the hill with the radio on static, didn't even notice till Ngoranga. I didn't cry. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of gumboot tea and I started writing down names. Not enemies. Not even allies. Threads. People who'd witnessed things. People who'd signed things. People standing around holding matches with no idea they were ankle-deep in dry grass. Because here's what Lachlan never understood about the quiet ones. We write everything down. That night, it honestly started as housekeeping. I lit a candle, cracked open an LMP, and dug out the old external drive I hadn't touched in years, the one labeled Stack version 0.9 in fading vivid, from back when South Stack was 5 people in a leaky office on Cuba Street sharing one heat pump and a toast-type press. I wasn't angry yet. I just don't like not knowing what people are playing with. See, Lachlan was always slippery. His idea of due diligence was deciding whether a bloke seemed sound while signing six-figure supplier deals at a rugby corporate box. And Tobias was the cleanup crew for corporate amnesia. Slick, efficient, and surgically lazy. Neither of them understood that old files don't rot. They wait. I started sorting. Original licensing drafts, founding documents, board minutes. Reading some of it felt like attending my own funeral. My name was everywhere, but only in the tracked changes, buried in the metadata, hanging off comments like Briar, please check jurisdiction wording. Every final version had been wiped clean and topped with Lachlan's smug little preamble about SouthStack's culture of innovation. And then I found it. A folder inside a zip file labeled founding/compliance_alpha. That far back. Back before Lachlan whitened his teeth and started calling himself a founder-operator. One clause. Short. Almost boring. Unless you knew what it did. Any transfer of core intellectual property licenses shall require dual authorization, the chief executive, and the designated compliance officer of record, as appointed by founding director Douglas Veal and filed under Clause 7.2, d. I sat very still. The fridge hummed like a freight train. The clause was clean. Unambiguous. Signed by Dougie Veal himself, back when he still had a desk, a pulse on the company, and a controlling stake. And there, at the bottom, in print that hadn't been looked at since before my niece was born, Compliance Officer of Record, Briar Kennard. No expiry. No successor. No revocation. I remembered the day we signed it. Dougie had insisted. He never trusted Lachlan with the IP, said the man had the ethics of a supermarket trolley, goes wherever you shove it and always drifts left. We drafted it, signed it, filed it with the company's official records and a copy with the lawyers in town. Then 2 years later Dougie got rolled in that ugly little boardroom coup. You might remember the wellness retreat expenses scandal if you read the business pages, and he took his Swandry and his principals and retired to a bock in the Marlborough Sounds. And nobody ever cleaned up after him. Not Lachlan. Apparently not even Tobias. My hands were shaking. My face was absolutely still. Because that clause wasn't a relic. It was a landmine, wired straight into the foundations of a $52 million deal. Every license transfer, every product built on that IP stack, every dollar of that valuation ran through a signature they didn't have. Mine. I checked the metadata. Untouched for 6 years. No edits, no views, one forgotten PDF sitting under a pile of prettier slide decks. I emailed it to my personal address. Then I printed 3 copies. One for my lawyer. One in a fireproof box. And one, I'm not even embarrassed, taped inside an empty Weet-Bix box in the pantry, because some traditions of paranoid womanhood deserve to be honored. You'd think I'd have been celebrating. I wasn't. It felt like finding a loaded gun someone else had dropped, with my fingerprints already on the grip. I lay awake all night listening to the wind try the windows, feeling something settle in my chest. Not fear. Clarity. Lachlan hadn't fired me. He'd just unlocked the one door I'd been polite enough to keep shut. They say betrayal never announces itself with trumpets. It arrives in the fine print. Mine arrived in a PDF stamped final. About a fortnight after my last day, Tobias and his parade of expensive juniors started circulating the acquisition packet for final review. I was never meant to see it. I'd been off-boarded, remember? No access, no involvement, no comment. But in his infinite carelessness, somebody on his team BCC'd the old compliance review email alias. An alias I had built, populated, and, as it turns out, still quietly monitored from my phone. So I got front row seats to my own erasure. At first I just skimmed, telling myself I was above it. Then I hit Appendix D, Legacy Licensing Protocols. And there was my clause. Except it wasn't. They'd changed 3 words. 3. shall require dual authorization by the chief executive, and the compliance officer of record had become may be authorized by the chief executive or the compliance officer of record. May. Or. Two tiny words, and suddenly the deadbolt I'd built was a door propped open with a jandal. A smoke alarm with the battery flicked out. I read it 5 times. It was like seeing your own signature traced over in crayon and framed as the original. So I took a breath, made a pot of tea, and wrote the most polite email of my entire life. Subject line: Quick query re clause 7.2, D. Hi Tobias, hope the deal prep's going well. Reviewing Appendix D, I noticed a small but meaningful deviation from the original clause as drafted and filed with the founding compliance records. I've attached the original for reference, along with the timestamped metadata and the founding director's sign-off. Happy to walk you through the original intent anytime. Namihi, Briar. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse. I just handed him the rope, coiled neatly, with a bow on it. 24 hours. Nothing. 48. Silence. At 72 hours I rang Marguerite, my old law school flatmate, who's now a partner doing mergers at one of the big Auckland firms, and asked her for a sanity check, friend to friend, hypothetically. Hypothetically, she said, they altered your clause without your consent and filed it in a deal packet? Yep, I said. Then hypothetically it's voidable, she said, and if it's material, which a dual authorization requirement on the core IP absolutely is, it could knock the legs out from under the entire license stack. Then she laughed, dry as a Central Otago summer. Briar, she said, you'd better hope the buyer's lawyers read past the buzzwords. Because if that version goes through, everything they're paying for is built on sand. And falsifying a filed compliance document, that's not naughty. That's the kind of thing the Law Society takes personally. That night I labeled every draft, cross-referenced the file hashes, and stored copies in 4 separate places, including a flash drive sellotaped inside that Weet-Bix box, which was getting crowded. And then I started watching. Every press release. Every LinkedIn post. Every thrilled to announce the next chapter of the South Stack journey that Lachlan burped onto the internet. They had no idea what they were sitting on. And I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done being polite. The thing about metadata that men like Lachlan never grasp is that it doesn't care about your title. It doesn't care about your watch, your quarter zip, or the keynote you gave in Sydney. Metadata is maths. It sits there, time-stamped and smug, whispering, you can't scrub me, darling. It started with a ping. I was reorganizing my spice rack, which is what I do instead of therapy, when a LinkedIn message arrived from one Felix Tumath, junior analyst at Coleridge Ridgeway Capital. Profile photo of a kid who probably still gets ID'd at the bottle shop. Hi Briar, came across your name on several early licensing drafts during our diligence review. Just wanted to confirm, were you ever formally removed as compliance officer of record? Thanks heaps. That's how it starts, eh? One simple question from someone too green to know he's just pulled the pin. I read it 3 times. Then I typed, slowly. Hi Felix. Good question. No, I was never formally removed. I was asked to prepare transition materials, but no updated designation was ever filed with the company records. Happy to help if you need anything further. Briar. Sending it felt like flicking a pebble into the Remutakas and hearing the echo come back as thunder. 2 hours later my phone rang, Sydney number. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to perform yet. That night I opened the good bottle of Pinot I'd been saving since Southstack's last funding round, back when I still believed Lachlan might grow into the job instead of just getting better at impersonating someone who had. And I replayed every conversation from the past 2 years. Every it's just procedural. Every we're simplifying the legacy frameworks. I used to think they were lazy. Turns out they were also blind. Next morning I checked the archive logs. Still listed. Still credentialed. My name baked into the audit trail of every clause that mattered, like initials carved into wet concrete 30 years ago. Then came the email from someone further up the Coleridge food chain, a senior associate called Hannah Rito. Different tone altogether. Measured. The kind of email a lawyer ghostwrites and a litigator proofreads. Hi Briar, following up on Felix's outreach. We've identified several documents under your authorship containing active licensing frameworks. We'd appreciate a short call to confirm the historical context of Clause 7.2d and related compliance obligations. I waited an hour. Replied with 3 available time slots. No exclamation marks. No emojis. On the call, I was calm and rehearsed. I used phrases like "to the best of my recollection" and "as recorded in the founding compliance file." I offered no opinions. Just facts, dates, file paths, names. At one point Hannah asked, "Did anyone at South Stack ever formally notify you of a change to your designation?" And I let the silence sit there for one long beat, like steam rising off a cup, before I said, "No." I was asked to prepare a handover guide. I was never notified of any revocation or reassignment. She was quiet for a second. Then, "Thank you, Briar. That's extremely helpful." We hung up, and just like that, the buyer knew something the seller didn't. The signature this deal needed was at Laughlin's. I didn't gloat. Didn't ring anyone. Didn't post anything cryptic with a sunset and a caption about karma. I poured one more glass, opened a fresh folder on my desktop, and named it When They Realize. Somewhere across town, Laughlin was sweating through a $400 shirt and didn't even know it yet. Quarter end was bearing down on him like a southerly. The completion bonus pool dangled in front of his face like a carrot soaked in single malt. He spent his days stalking the office shouting things like "let's get this over the line, people," while ignoring red flags blinking like a Christmas tree in a power surge. Tuesday morning he held what he called a war room, which is corporate for yelling at people who are too mortgaged to quit. Tobias sat there flipping through printed contracts like a man auditioning for the role of someone competent. Neither of them noticed that the buyer's side had gone very, very quiet. That same afternoon, Coleridge's senior counsel dropped a note into the deal room. Relicensing appendix, foundational clause integrity in question, authorship unverified, please advise. Laughlin waved it off. Got Tobias to slather some boilerplate over it about executive discretion and operational continuity. Patching a leaky roof with newspaper, basically. What he didn't know, and oh, the timing was chef's kiss, was that I'd already had my own email from Hannah. We've identified Clause 7.2d as material to licensing continuity. To confirm enforceability, could you verify authorship and provide any historical documentation? I didn't rush. I read it twice. Then I brought out the receipts. The original clause, clean and dated. The full approval chain. The internal memo from Dougie Veal himself stating, "This wording is not to be modified without the written approval of the compliance officer of record, B. Kennard, to remain listed." The digital signature log from our old contract platform. The version hashes. I even had a screenshot of the old company chat where Dougie wrote, "Briar drafts contracts the way other people pour concrete, and you don't argue with concrete." So I replied. "Hi Hannah. Attached is the original clause, authored by me on March 14, 2019, together with the approval chain, timestamped metadata, and the founding director's digital sign-off, per Compliance Policy 7.2d. Let me know if you need anything further." No bold. No underline. The truth doesn't need formatting. 3 hours later, an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then a text from Marguerite. "Mate. Just heard through the grapevine the buyer's team is at DEFCON 2. Someone dropped the original clause and a smoking gun document chain straight into their laps. Tell me that was you." I didn't reply. I went to the kitchen, got out yesterday's leftover cottage pie, and ate the most dignified plate of reheated mince of my life. Standing up, at the bench, looking out at the harbor. Because this wasn't revenge yet. It wasn't even triumph. It was inevitability. They finally knew I wasn't the ghostwriter. I was the signature. And I wasn't in their rearview mirror anymore. I was standing in the middle of the road, holding the keys to their $52 million payday. Lachlan always hated video calls. Said the camera flattened his presence. Which, from a man with the natural charisma of a parking machine, was almost poetic. So when the buyer's legal team requested a last-minute clarification meeting, he turned up annoyed, collar pressed, spray tan clinging on for dear life, doing that little chin nod he practices whenever anyone says the word valuation. On the other side of the screen sat Coleridge Ridgeway's lead counsel, Sinead Mulholland. If a scalpel wore reading glasses and billed in 6-minute increments, it would look like Sinead. Beside her, Hannah, young Felix, and one more participant. Camera off. No nameplate. Me. I didn't say a word the entire meeting. I didn't need to. The first few minutes were pleasantries. Then Sinead leaned in, just slightly. Before execution, we need to flag one matter. It concerns Clause 7.2, d, governing the foundational IP license transfer. We've compared the wording in your appendix against the original clause as authored and filed by Ms. Briar Kennard. Lachlan, still smiling, sure, yep, minor tidy-up, formatting mostly. Sinead, not blinking, no. Not formatting. A material alteration. Tobias shifted in his seat. We interpreted the clause as permissive. Executive discretion. Sinead tapped her pen once. Your interpretation is noted. It's also wrong. The silence that followed had texture. You could hear Tobias's confidence going down like a paddling pool with a slow leak. Sinead carried on, even and unhurried. The clause as originally filed and signed by your founding director requires dual authorization for any transfer of the core licenses. One of those signatures must come from the compliance officer of record. She paused. Briar Kennard. Lachlan opened his mouth. Closed it. Smiled again, tighter. Look, Briar's no longer with the company, so I'm sure there's a workaround. We can execute on the executive side and warrant the rest. No, said Sinead, flat as a courtroom door. We can't execute until she signs. And Mr. Price, there's a second matter. The altered wording was submitted to our deal room as a true copy of a filed compliance document. We take document integrity extremely seriously. Your counsel missed the original. We didn't. My camera stayed off. My mic stayed muted. And I promise you, every person in that meeting could feel me anyway. Lachlan's eye did a little twitch. We've got internal alignment on this. That clause is what, 6 years old? Hannah, soft and surgical, correct. And still active, still enforceable, and still attached to the IP your entire valuation is built on. Tobias, voice got a bit reedy, we assumed the role was obsolete. Sinead raised one eyebrow exactly 4 millimeters. You assumed wrong. Lachlan glanced sideways, off camera, like a kid looking for the lifeguard halfway through drowning. And me, I just sat there in my kitchen in my slippers, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. You could almost hear it. $52 million, tapping politely on the glass, waiting for a pen held by the woman they'd tried to rub out. The in-person signing was set for the following Thursday, Auckland, 14th floor. Lachlan showed up dressed like a man auditioning to play himself in a documentary he assumed had a happy ending. Navy suit, fresh haircut, a watch so reflective it could guide ferries into the harbor. He swept in trailed by Tobias and a junior carrying branded South Stack pens on a tray, like he planned to autograph his way into history. The buyer's side was already seated. Felix. Hannah. Sinead, glacial in gray. And one empty chair near the end of the table. Mine. Morning, all, Lachlan chirped. Shall we make it official? Nobody answered. Sinead cleared her throat and gestured at the stack on the table. As discussed, we'll be executing today, pending final signature from all required parties. Tobias smiled half a beat too late. We've reviewed everything on our end. Ready to proceed. That's when Sinead, without looking up, said, "Not quite." She slid the stack sideways and tapped the top page with a red-capped pen. "This instrument requires a second signatory for the IP transfer. The compliance officer of record." Lachlan did a nervous little laugh. "Right, yes, your position on that is noted, but candidly, Briar left under, well, strained circumstances. A disgruntled ex-employee shouldn't be able to hold up a deal of this size. We're prepared to wear that risk." Sinead didn't move a muscle. "She's not disgruntled. She's documented. She's the named compliance officer of record under Clause 7.2d, with no revocation ever filed. That makes her a required signatory. Without her, Mr. Price, you do not own what you are attempting to sell." That sentence landed like a slap across a chessboard. Lachlan went the color of cold porridge. Tobias started flicking through the packet like the answer might be hiding between the staples. The junior with the pen tray looked like she wanted to climb inside her own blazer. Then the door opened. I walked in wearing gray. No jewelry, hair tied back, flat shoes, the exact opposite of Lachlan's campaign of polished desperation. I walked in like I'd been paying rent on that room for years. Nobody spoke. Lachlan stood frozen somewhere between outrage and dread, his mouth doing a small silent arithmetic of everything he'd said to me in that folder on the keyboard meeting. Sinead gestured to the empty chair. "Ms. Kennard. Thank you for joining us." I nodded once and sat down. And then, page by page, I read. Slowly. The way I always do. I corrected 2 cross-references. I clarified a definition. I struck out 1 rogue handle with the red pen Sinead passed me, and I swear she almost smiled doing it. Then I reached the signature page, and stopped. Lachlan leaned across, voice low and sweaty. "Briar. Look. If this is about money." I didn't look at him. Because it was, partly, and we'd already sorted it, and he was the last person in the building to know. Sinead slid a fresh sheet in front of me. The revised execution terms my lawyer and Coleridge had spent 4 days hammering out, after I made it very clear that I'd watched one too many stories where the quiet woman saves the deal and gets a pat on the head for it. Not this one. The terms were simple. A consultancy retainer for Coleridge's new oversight board, reporting to no one at South Stack. Full independence written into the deal itself. And a transaction facilitation fee of 1.5% of the purchase price, payable on completion. For those of you doing the maths while your dinner goes around in the microwave, that's $780,000. For one signature. Or more accurately, for 6 years of signatures nobody had bothered to read. I glanced at the final line. My name, in clean print, in a document I hadn't drafted for once. And I signed. My signature. Not his. Mine activated the license transfer. My ink made the 52 million real. For a moment, nobody spoke. Just the soft shuffle of contracts being collected and sealed. Felix looked at me with something close to awe. Tobias stared at the table like he was hoping it would open up and file him somewhere. And Lachlan smiled that watery, too wide smile of a man holding his mask on with both hands while the floor moves. He stood, stuck his hand out to Sinead. "Well. Glad we got it over the line." Sinead gave him a 3-finger handshake and said, "We'll be in touch regarding transition arrangements." Then, with no change of tone at all, "Not Miss Kennard's transition, Mr. Price. Yours." The press release went out that afternoon. Coleridge Ridgway completes acquisition of South Stack, establishes independent compliance board chaired by Briar Kennard. That last bit was non-negotiable. My retainer was locked in, my authority stitched into the transaction documents themselves. No dotted line to anyone with a quarter zip. And then the consequences, since I know you lot in the comments always ask, and fair enough, you should. Because of the falsified clause, Coleridge invoked the warranty provisions. Half of Lachlan's personal payout, a bit over $2 million, went into escrow against document integrity claims, and the indemnity meant he'd be funding the remediation out of his own pocket. His golden completion bonus evaporated, because the bonus pool was conditional on a clean diligence certificate, and his was anything but. 2 hours after the press release, the new board called him into a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. He came out without his lanyard and took the lift down alone. The official line said he was transitioning to a strategic advisory role. The actual line, which Hannah told me over coffee a month later, was considerably shorter and contained the word liability twice. And Tobias. Oh, Tobias. Coleridge's lawyers referred the altered clause to the Law Society's Standards Committee, attached to a very tidy bundle of metadata, because as I may have mentioned, metadata is maths, and maths doesn't do mates rates. Last I heard, he's suspended from practice pending the outcome, his anchor cufflinks presumably in a drawer somewhere, going nowhere. Turns out when you change 3 words in a filed compliance document, the profession changes a few words about you. Practicing becomes not. That night I drove past the old South Stack building one last time. The logo looked smaller. The windows looked like windows instead of a fortress. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. I'd already written myself back into the middle of the story, in ink, with witnesses. Dougie Veal rang me the next week from his balk in the Sounds, laughing so hard he had to put the phone down twice. Told you, he kept saying. Told you that clause would outlive all of us. I told him it nearly outlived me. He said, no, Briar. Things you build properly don't turn on you. Only people do. And look, if you take anything away from all this, take these. Document everything, even when, especially when, nobody's asking you to, because the paper trail you keep on a boring Tuesday is the lifeboat you'll need on a terrible Thursday. Never confuse being quiet with being powerless. The loudest person in the room is usually just the most insured against silence. If someone shows you they'll erase your name from your own work, believe them the first time, and start keeping your copies somewhere they can't reach. And when your moment finally comes, don't scream, don't gloat, don't burn it all down. Read every page. Fix the punctuation. Name your price. Then sign. They tried to erase my name. Instead, they ended up paying nearly $800,000 for the privilege of printing it. Lachlan wanted to be the face of the company. Turns out the only ink that mattered was mine. I've had a long time to sit with how all of this actually happened, and the more I turn it over, the less it looks like luck. Lachlan didn't lose because the universe owed me a favor. He lost because he built his whole career on standing in front of work he never bothered to understand, and a man like that is always one careful reader away from the floor falling out. Tobias didn't get suspended because he was unlucky either. He changed 3 words in a document that wasn't his to change, and the thing about a paper trail is that it has no loyalty and no fear. It simply remembers. Cause and effect. You can dress it up in quarter zips and spray tans, but it grinds on underneath all of that, patient as the tide coming back into the harbor. What I want you to take from my story isn't really about revenge, even though I won't pretend the signing wasn't sweet. It's about 3 things I had to learn the slow way, and I think they're worth more than any payout. The first is character. I never lied, not once, through that whole mess. Every email I sent Tobias and the buyer was true to the comma. I didn't need to invent anything, because the truth I'd quietly kept was already enough. When you live honestly on the boring days, you build a kind of armor you don't even notice until the day someone tries to rewrite you. People who cut corners assume everyone else does too, and that assumption is exactly the crack you can walk straight through. Be the person whose records hold up, and you'll rarely need to raise your voice. The second is wisdom, which I think is just attention that refuses to switch off. Lachlan saw a forgotten old clause. I saw what it was actually for. The difference between us was never intelligence, it was that I read things all the way to the end, even when nobody was watching, even when it seemed like it would never matter. Knowledge isn't power until the moment it suddenly is, and that moment never sends a warning. So learn your craft properly. Understand the foundations under your own work. The deepest thing you know on an ordinary Tuesday might be the only thing standing between you and being erased on a terrible Thursday. And the third is grit, the quiet kind. The night Lachlan dropped that folder on my keyboard, the easiest thing in the world would have been to cry in the car and take the small severance and disappear. Instead, I went home and started writing down names. Not because I was brave, but because I refused to let someone else write the ending of my own story. Strength isn't always a raised voice or a slammed door. Sometimes it's a candle, a cold cup of tea, and the patience to read one more folder when you'd rather sleep. So document everything, even when no one asks. Stay honest even when it costs you in the short run. Keep learning the work beneath your work. And when your moment comes, and it will, don't shout. Read every page. Know your worth. Then sign your own name. They tried to erase me. I just made sure the record remembered me first.